Well, Rania, we want to turn back here to the United States to a so-called hot button issue. I kind of hate that phrase, but nevertheless a big one. And that is the issue of quote unquote crime and policing, which of course is becoming a bigger and bigger issue because we're getting closer and closer to the election. So funny how that tends to happen, but a lot of misinformation out there for sure, but it's doing a lot to shape how people view the political choices in front of them in the country. And we are very honored to be joined as we continue this conversation by Kiah Duggins, who's an attorney who litigates against police abuse and unconstitutional bail practices with the Civil Rights Corps. Kiah, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Well, the pleasure is all ours. And you know, here we are, we're about 3 weeks away from the midterm elections in the US. So of course, everything, there's quite a bit. I was on the RNC Research Twitter the other day, which they put out these little hit pieces, and like 90% of the stuff, of course, is about quote unquote crime. So my first question for you, I guess, is maybe a framing question. I mean, it feels that this is an issue that is obviously ever present. Public safety is something that concerns everyone, but it feels that it's just a conversation that is completely dominated only by one side. And the perception that is put forward is deeply blinkered. So, I mean, how problematic, I don't know if I should ask you on a scale of 1 to 10, do you think the mass media, mainstream media discourse is on these issues?
Thank you for that question. I do think that the mainstream discourse is problematic, mostly because I think that we have a lot of shared values. I think that there are a lot of people, most people, care about their own safety, care about the safety of their communities. And so everybody cares about public safety. And where the conversation diverges is talking about what do we mean when we say public safety, what actually makes us feel safe and free, and what makes a society safe and free. And so the current conversation that centers around policing and jailing people is problematic because I think if you asked most people what makes them feel safe and free and asked them to tell a story about when they felt safe or free, they would not have police or cages in that story. And so we all know that the things that make us feel safe, the things that make us feel secure, the things that make us feel connected to the people around us are basic human rights like housing, healthcare, education, clean water, walkable cities, so many things that can make us feel safe that have nothing to do with police and nothing to do with mass incarceration. So the national discourse, what my hope would be is that it could shift to talking about actual safety and what makes people feel safe in their own communities and in their own neighborhoods.
Mm-hmm. That's such a good point, because oftentimes one of the issues that has been sort of on like prominently displayed, at least in certain like in social media and then in headlines, is the issue of homelessness and trying to connect that to crime. And what you're saying is totally right. It's actually the fact that people just don't want to see homeless people because it makes them sad and people deserve housing. And it's not necessarily because a homeless person is committing crimes against people. But the other issue too that I'm seeing oftentimes as well is the idea that crime is up. And this is something that the media has been playing into. And this is something that certain figures and certain media outlets have been playing into as well, when it's actually not exactly true. Can you talk a little bit about that, the issue of crime being up, and what that actually means and what that's actually referring to and what the reality is when it comes to crime around the country?
Yes. So I'll start with the comment you made in the beginning about people experiencing homelessness. And I think you're right that when most people see other people experiencing homelessness, it might make them feel uncomfortable. It might make them feel sad. It might make them feel worried. And all of those feelings are valid, but none of those feelings are feelings of not being safe. Discomfort and being unsafe can be two different things. And it's, I think, very important to separate that. And I think it's important to talk about how people are conflating homelessness with crime because the solution, the more direct solution to homelessness would be housing as opposed to physically restraining somebody and putting them in a cage for not having a home, the more simple solution would be to give them a home. And so the solution has nothing to do with the criminal legal system. And then to answer the second point, which is related about people's perceptions of crime being up, the data shows that crime has fallen significantly since the 90s, has continued to steadily fall since the 90s, but people's perceptions of crime have gone up. So the data is not matching up with people's perceptions. And I think part of that is because of the discomfort that people feel with seeing dystopian capitalism and its consequences around them, but also because of anti-Blackness, people conflating Blackness with criminality. And so I think it's important to debunk these things. You know, most of the calls that people make to police, according to a study that was done between 2019 and 2021, are not about violent crime. In fact, I think fewer than 3% of calls to 911 are about violent crime. They're mostly about abandoned cars, people with mental health issues, things like that, a missing cat. And so there's so many other creative solutions that we could apply to the problems that people are actually facing in their lives that have nothing to do with police or cages.
You know, that's such a good point. I saw someone post on social media the other day about how they felt bad, but that every time they drove, they were calling 911 to report like potholes and roadkill. And they were just like, oh, you know, it's the easiest number to dial to report something because you can just hit the little button on your phone. And, you know, it's sort of a funny thing, but I just thought, I mean, you know, as you're saying, that being the bulk of it is such a piece. And I think it speaks to, you know, the other point you were making about the importance of debunking, and also the point you made in the very beginning about, you know, what we know about what really makes people safe is how little evidence there really is that, you know, policing is connected. I think people say, oh, well, if there's shoplifting, if you have more cops and, you know, metal detectors, it's all going to be fine. And all these other things that are always, you know, seem like they make sense. There's an Occam's razor to it. But then when you drill down into the actual reality, I think the thing that you find is that it's not the case. So I was hoping you could just talk a little bit about, you know, maybe just a few of the things that stand out to you about like myths about policing that people tend to believe, but that are ultimately not true.
Yes. So I would say once again that people, I think, come to these feelings about policing. A lot of people come to these feelings because they genuinely are concerned about their own safety, of the safety of their loved ones. And something that I like to communicate to people is that by the police's own data, like by the FBI's own data, police don't solve most violent crimes. Over half of violent crimes, according to the FBI itself, do not are not solved by police. And that number gets closer to 60 or 65% when we start talking about violent crimes, violent sexual crimes, such as rape and sexual assault. And so what I like to say to people is if you really care about preventing violence, if you really care about making sure people get to live safe and free lives, the police are not really good at ensuring that, even by their own metrics and their own data. So that's an invitation for us to think creatively about what actually would help. And all peer-reviewed research, all empirical data points to investing in things like housing, healthcare, education, clean water, after-school programs, and other things that livable wages, other things that make people secure and happy in their lives. And honestly, not only right now do police not really address violence, even by their own metrics, but the criminal legal system is violent itself. Police kill on average 3 people a day in the United States. When people are put in a cage pre-trial, which means they're put in a cage before there's been any evidence from the government that they actually committed a crime. A lot of times people lose their housing, they lose their job, they lose the ability to take care of their children because they're held in a cage by the government, which then destabilizes their lives and increases chances for violence. So I like to help people understand that the criminal legal system actually doesn't support our core value of wanting to live safe and free lives, and actually exacerbates violence a lot of the time. And so we need to think creatively about what other solutions would be more helpful to make sure we actually are safe.
Yeah, I think that that's a really good point. You're talking about what actually ends up happening to people when they end up arrested in like pretrial detention or jail or whatever. Because there's also been this other common talking point. You'll see like one case somewhere that's like a rare exception, given a big headline, or people online are making a big deal out of it. And it'll be like some guy who's been arrested 40 times or something was like let out on bail and then committed another crime. And it's like, oh my God, our system's out of control. It can't even contain violent people who need to be in jail. Can you walk us through like what somebody who actually is arrested goes through? Because it's actually the polar opposite of that. In the US, if you don't have money and you're arrested, what happens to you?
Yes, that's a great question. So, when you are arrested in the United States, it's important to note that most criminal legal systems are at the city, municipal, or county level. So they vary throughout the United States. But generally, when people are arrested, they have to go to an initial hearing where the judge wants to make them promise that they will come back to court for their trial and for all the other court hearings. And in the past, up until the very recent past, people used to be able to just promise that they will come back to court and that was it. And they would go on and live their lives. But in very recent history, about the last 50 years or so, judges have started attaching money, like a deposit, to that promise, saying you have to pay and you'll get your money back if you come to court to back that promise up. If you can't pay that deposit, then you sit in a cage. If you can pay that deposit, even if you're accused of the same crime, then you get to go free. So it's wealth-based detention. And what that means is, like I said earlier, if you're sitting in a cage for weeks and months and years waiting for your trial, you lose your housing, job, children, ability to study, all of these things. So it completely destabilizes people's lives simply because they can't afford an arbitrary number that was just supposed to be a promise that they would come back to court. And so the headlines that we're seeing, like I really like the example you gave of these headlines where they say somebody was arrested 40 times and then they, whatever. And to me, that should be a ding on the criminal legal system, because it's like, well, clearly arresting them is not keeping us safe. If you had to do it 40 times, then maybe we need to try something else. Maybe arresting them, putting them in cages is not helpful here if we had to do it 40 times. And also, I think it's important to ground ourselves and remember that everybody who's in jail pre-trial is still legally innocent. The government has not presented evidence of guilt. And so it is a very scary and violent prospect to think that the government is allowed to physically restrain your body in a cage without any evidence, simply because they want to make sure you come back to court. I don't think that's what a safe and free society looks like. And so that's why we actually advocate for people to be released pre-trial so they can get back to their lives and contribute to their communities and be innocent until proven guilty.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I lived in D.C. for 15 years where there is not cash bail, and almost everyone comes back every single time. I mean, it's like a totally fake problem, but here we are. And I want to just, come back to that and underline a point you raised earlier about, the role of anti-blackness and racism in the context of this, because, one other thing I often think about when I think about this conversation is you just see a million images of Black people who have allegedly done something. But we know that there is a huge amount of wage theft in the country. I don't know if I've ever seen a photo of someone in a newspaper, even when the article is about wage theft, of like who did it. There's no humanization of these rich people stealing people's money. But, when it comes to someone who allegedly stole something out of a store, they're going to make sure that the camera footage from inside the store is everywhere. And it just feels like that goes to so much to just not only your preconceived notions, but then to further fuel the perception that other people have about who the quote unquote criminal classes.
Yes, that's exactly right. I think that the media plays a large role in promoting these ideas about Black criminality. I think a relatively recent example of how media's portrayals, inaccurate portrayals of Black criminality actually had very devastating effects on the Black community is in the 1990s, when the Clintons were promoting the super predator idea, saying that young Black kids were like less than human. And so many people now today have watched, the Netflix documentary Central Park 5 and see how that played out and see how that harmed so many Black people. By having that perception that Black people are less than human and Black people are inherently criminal and that Black people need to be physically restrained in order for everybody else to be safe. And on an even deeper note, our criminal legal system, specifically policing, was designed specifically to control Black people. Policing has evolved from slave patrols and also, evolved from slave patrols. And so there's inherent anti-Blackness in the system as it is, which is also harmful, which is also, once again, another invitation to think about, what can we do? What is something else we can do? Because this is clearly not working and it's causing a lot of harm to a lot of communities, especially when there's other people who are doing very harmful things, wage theft, the people who were involved in the 2008 financial crisis, people who are poisoning our environment and causing pollution and dirty water and things like that, are causing harm on massive scales. And we are not having these big news articles about them or mugshots or anything like that. And so I think so much of our criminal legal system is designed as a tool for protecting the interests of the ruling class. And it's important to question that and think, what can we do to make sure that we, in our own lives, from our own positionality, are all safe and free? And the answers to that, I think, are very creative and very simple at the same time.
Mm-hmm. Well, Kiah, very informative, great conversation. Really appreciate it. I'm sure you have many, many things going on. So thanks so much for giving us some of your time to help sort through all this here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you.